All right, I'm back with another video. My journey to the Dark Tower continues, this time with Book 5, Wolves of the Calla by Stephen King. So I've been reading through the Dark Tower series this year, and I've really been enjoying it. And I've been mixing in other books here and there, but I've been wanting to, especially with my read through of Stephen King's books, just like plow through this series. I talked about them all individually, but I really enjoyed Drawing of the Three, Wastelands, and Wizard and Glass. So 2, 3, 4, I think was an extremely impressive run of books. I think Wolves of the Calla High Level it's still a great book, but I definitely think it's a step below 2, 3, and 4. And I'll definitely talk about reasons why. I will say that while Wizard and Glass was very interesting to me, it was unique because mostly it was set in the past. Like 90% of a very long book was set not in the present day. And then we had a little bit of the last 100 pages or so kind of pushed the story forward a little bit with our primary characters. So I thought going into this book, given that Wizard and Glass was set up that way, that this book was really going to propel the story forward and really push our quartet forward towards the Dark Tower. And honestly, in a lot of ways, it really didn't. And I was very surprised by how small scale this book felt. And I think that it's not a bad thing per se, because again, this is still a great book. But I do think when you look at the arc of the series as a whole, it's just a little interesting to me and a little unusual, I guess I would say. I also thought, given how the majority of Wizard and Glass was basically a prequel, I thought that we would pick up with our characters and hit the ground running, but I was very surprised that there's a prologue to this book that basically is just a conversation between people in a small town, which is the primary location of this book, Calla Sturgis, which is near the town of Thunderclap, which is mentioned at the end of Wizard and Glass, but otherwise we've had no time spent here. We don't know who any of these characters are at the beginning, and it's like a 30 to 40 page section, and I thought it was a very bold choice to do this because, again, it's like I felt like I was itching after Wizard and Glass to get back to the present day with our characters and see what's going on and push the story forward, and he makes you wait a little bit longer even. So I was trying to get my head around that a little bit, but I ended up thinking this was a fantastic section by the end of it because King does the small town so well. I think it's actually what he does best. You get a sense of a place feeling very lived in. You get a lot of different characters, a lot of different perspectives, and it just feels very real very quickly. And they basically do a really good job of introducing kind of the core conflict of this book. This small town, it's basically the plot of the movie Seven Samurai, which came out forever ago. But it's basically this small town of farmers and merchants every so often get visited, in quotes, by these enemies they call the wolves, and they basically prey on the children. Specifically, I think there's an interesting kind of they specifically target twins, and the reason for why that happens gets revealed much later in the book. But at the start, all you know is they're basically warned by a character who ends up being very important in this book, a robot who's programmed named Andy, that the wolves are coming in basically a month's time or however many days. And there's so much back and forth in this prologue between these characters of, should we fight back? Should we let them do what they always do? Will things get worse if we try to fight back, etc.? And again, I think there's really good perspectives back and forth on it in both cases. And what ends up being really interesting about this section is the reintroduction of Father Callahan from Salem's Lot. And he ends up being a very prominent and very important character in this book. And I thought, I knew, I had heard, just because I've been a fan of King and I've listened to stuff on his books for so long, I knew that he was in this book. So it wasn't a huge surprise to me, but the way that he's introduced towards the tail end of this prologue section is really, really well done. He's kind of like this mysterious, like shrouded figure. They call him an old man, and he's like the priest that kind of does his thing. And he definitely is respected. And he's the one that reveals that our gunslingers are not far away and they are coming, basically. And so it ends on this prologue on very like an interesting, like, you know, some people in the town want to fight back, and they think their way to do so would be with our quartet of gunslingers. There was a section here that I really liked, the writing from King, that I wanted to read. This is where one of the guys who's coming forward and really trying to argue for them fighting back. He says, "I've almost come to the end. I keep thinking of trees. You can strip the leaves of a strong tree and it will live. Cut its bark with many names and it will grow its skin over them again. You can even take from the heartwood and it will live. But if you take of the heartwood again and again and again, there will come a time when even the strongest tree must die. I've seen it happen on my farm, and it's an ugly thing. They die from the inside out. You can see it in the leaves as they turn yellow from the trunk to the tips of the branches, and that's what the wolves are doing to this little village of ours, what they're doing to our Calla." I thought that's just like very, very elegantly written. And again, I think it sums up a conflict of what they're facing. And some people agree, some people don't agree. So that's the prologue. And then the remainder of the book is established in basically 3 sections. So part 1 is called Tadash. That's where we meet up with our quartet. Again, they're kind of back on their travels. They don't get super far before they get approached by Father Callahan. But the Todash is an interesting thing that I think King introduces in this book, where it's sort of a way that he explains how the doors were able to open up in the drawing of the 3. And it's basically how you can jump to various different points in time. And it's not... there's kind of 2 ways about it. In one case, which happens in this first part, it seems like a dream state where it's like you're in a real place in a real time, but you're not actually there. You're like kind of half there. And he introduces it with these characters called the Mani in this small town, where it's kind of like a religious rite, and it's like a very like big deal to be able to do this kind of a thing. But later in the book, this will basically be introduced as the more or less the reason why they're able to go back and forth between. It's this kind of like jumping between. So I didn't love it because I didn't need him to explain kind of something that was like already, I thought, just like established and was very cool in the drawing of the 3. But regardless, basically, we were introduced to the glass, like from Wizard and Glass, and how from Maryland's Rainbow, there's these different things. Father Callahan has the most powerful one, Black 13, and that's how he's able to see and know that the gunslingers are there, and that's how the gunslingers are able to use basically this to open up another doorway, which is essentially a portal to all these different places and times they need to go. Thought that was a little convenient that we like just learned about it in Wizard and Glass, and now all of a sudden, like, here's the most powerful one, and it so happened to be held by Father Callahan. But if you can get past that, I think it's a pretty interesting plot device. So again, you can feel him, I think, the mechanics of the story. You can feel him trying to work, like explaining how this stuff works in the universe, even though it's already been established. But in any case, this was my least favorite part of the book, I will say, because we spent a lot of time in those kind of dream states, and each one of them, Eddie and Jake, were going back to the New York, kind of following the time when Jake went and he went to the bookstore where Calvin Tower, who was introduced, I believe it was in the Wastelands for the first time. And we basically see that again, but we see it after the fact with Eddie, and Eddie sees the guys, Balazar, who he'll end up like in his time before he's drawn, will face. I didn't love rehashing the kind of stuff we've done before. I felt like those sections took a long time to kind of get through. Again, I want to see like what's happening right now, but it does end up being important as they kind of establish their plan going forward and what they're ultimately going to do. There's also introduced here, my least favorite part of the book definitely was the character Susanna in this. She hasn't been my favorite character throughout the whole series, I will say. But it's now introduced that because of the events of the Wastelands. She's pregnant, but it's essentially with like, it's a new identity that's basically being formed, like a new woman again, how she had all these different split personalities in the drawing of the three, and she became Susanna. Now there's this new person called Mia that will kind of like overtake her at times. So not a huge fan of that coming up again. And I didn't like this kind of plot device being introduced, but I'm wondering and hoping that if in the last two books, it ends up being better. So Eddie and Jake spend time in New York. You're introduced to this character, Mia, essentially. And Roland basically watches her in the middle of the night and knows that like Susanna's not herself. So he's pretty much aware of it. And then at the end of this section, they are introduced to Father Callahan and Overholser. He's one of the town, kind of like the giants of the town, who's very on the fence about fighting back originally. And so I like, by the time we get to when Father Callahan is introduced, the dynamics they have back and forth of explaining the wolves, explaining how the threat is, and then Father Callahan talking about like how Tadash works and that he has the Black 13, as it's called. That's how he's able to know. There's a lot of really interesting back and forth there that I do like. It's mainly just those like dream-like sequences at the beginning that I wasn't a huge fan of. Then part 2 is called Telling Tales. This is where our quartet goes to Calla Bryn Sturgis. They introduce themselves, and basically, and I think this section is really good. Basically, they say, you know, if the town wants them and asks for them to protect from the wolves, they're going to do so because that's their duty as gunslingers. And what I think is really cool is we see kind of each of them in their own way go off and have like their own little missions or objectives where they're trying to get to know people of the town. They're trying to kind of learn about the threat and figure out the best way that they can handle this. They're trying to deal with people that don't think they should be there. This section is really, really good. So it starts where they're basically introduced, and Roland kind of like, he's introduced by the guy, I forget his first name. His last name is Jaffords. He's the one who's like really standing up in the prologue. He introduces Roland. There's this really good scene where Roland gets up there, gives a little speech. He makes Eddie give part of the speech. And then Roland, like, again, he's trying to, like, you can see the kind of how being a gunslinger really works in his mind, because he's trying to use this, like, diplomacy almost to win them over. And there's, like, this sequence where he does this, like, dance that they all love. And it kind of helps them, like, trust him and the rest of our main characters. And again, I think Roland is just such a good character, and I think he's so interesting, and I just really like him. So following that, we basically get to where, again, King does this so well. We learn about characters of the town. We learn about the town's past. We learn about the wolves and kind of who they are and what they do. The one thing I didn't love is Callahan basically gives his story of everything that happened and how he got there. Well, I think it's really interesting, obviously, the connection to Salem's Lot. I thought these sections in particular just went on way too long. I like when somebody like Father Callahan or a different member of the town has a conversation with our characters and they tell them kind of more about whatever it is, and there's a conversation back and forth and we can like see our characters' responses and perspectives. Several times in this book, King will basically flip to where like the text will be in italics, and he's essentially telling the story, but it's set just in the past. So it's no longer saying like, well, Callahan said this, Eddie responded that, Roland responded this. It's just basically giving you the narrative of what happened as if like you're just reading it from that perspective. Those were the sections that I thought, like, it started off really, really cool, kind of recapping what happens to Father Callahan towards the end of Salem's Lot with his crisis of faith. And then he kind of lives like a wayward life, trying to figure out what to do. He's struggling with his alcoholism. All that stuff I thought was awesome. But then it just dragged on way too long. I think if you were to add up the 3 little chapters of Callahan's tale, as it's called, would be over 100 pages. So ultimately, I just thought that was too long, even though, again, it's really cool to have Callahan back as a character. So that was the part of this section that I did think kind of held it back. we also see in this section that Jake basically goes off with, and he stays with somebody that he befriends that's his age, which we haven't really seen from him, which is kind of cool. And basically, like, Eddie and Susanna will go and like talk to different people, and they'll all kind of like learn in different ways. And Roland's kind of off doing his own thing. And so again, I think we get a cool view of the quartet like actually working together as a unit, and kind of like they have an overall objective, but they're all kind of using their skills in different ways to get to know these people and figure out a plan. This is where they introduce I'm forgetting the name, but the way that some people in the town defend themselves, like women in the town, they have these like special plates. There's like a folklore tale that King puts in there about a guy that uses it, or excuse me, a woman that uses it against a guy, and she kills him. And then this kind of becomes the lore of the women that like follow that practice. And so this gets introduced, and we learn that's going to be something they use against the wolves. Eddie goes and talks to the oldest living person in the town who was alive the last time that the wolves came by, and he kind of like talked more about how it went, and he had like a personal interaction with one of the wolves. So Eddie learns that. Roland, all the while, he's learning more about the Black 13. He finds it's called the Unfound Door, or the Doorway Cave, as it ends to be called, that they'll end up using a lot. And then Susanna's secret of her new like personality, Mia, becomes a huge point of contention. It's obviously a threat to all of them, but Roland is mostly worried about the quartet breaking up, and so he basically keeps it to himself. Jake ends up noticing it himself in the middle of one of the nights, and so he ends up confronting Roland. And I think there's just such a good again, King is so good at the interactions between these characters. But there's a sequence where Jake is just basically getting mad at Roland and telling him that he's wrong and that they have to stick together no matter what, and Roland basically acquiesces that he's right. And I thought it was cool to see like Jake challenge Roland in this way, and I think we see similar things between Roland and Eddie as well in this book, which are quite good. And then Father Callahan basically finishes his story. He talks about using that doorway cave being saved in his, in the present day in New York for him, and then being pulled over into Calla Bryn Sturgis. There's a pretty cool reveal that he's approached by the Man in Black, and there's a sequence where like basically in the Gunslinger, as Jake and Roland are going across the desert, the Man in Black and Callahan are basically behind them, watching them across the horizon, which I think is a pretty cool sequence. Then the next part is called The Wolves. So this builds to the actual confrontation itself. We learn a couple of really important things in this section. So the quote unquote villain, obviously it's told to be this set of characters called the Wolves, but I think that there's a couple of notes that he puts in there that I think kind of telegraph this a little too easily, but basically the robot Andy is actually a villain, and one of the members of the town, it's the dad of the friend that he befriends, basically they've been selling out the town to the wolves, basically just like for protection for him and for his kid. And Jake realizes this, he learns it, and they kind of have to figure out what they're going to do, because now they know like this is how the wolves know to come at a certain time. And I think it's a good sequence. Again, it's just maybe a little too convenient of like how the reveal is done towards the end and how it gets buttoned up or whatever. But I still do think it's somewhat interesting, and Jake really struggles with this. I think I'm not a huge fan of his character, but I do think this gave him somewhat of a good character arc, because he's now struggling with like feeling like he can actually be a kid, and then he has a friend that that he likes and likes him, but now all of a sudden his dad is a traitor, and now that everyone knows it, like things are not going to end well for him. And so he has this struggle of like not wanting to lose his friend, but also knowing his life's about to be ruined in some way or another. We also get, I'm trying to remember all the specifics of this because there's a lot that happens. We do get, we get a reveal that, well, I guess Susanna approaches the rest of the quartet and says, like, this is happening to me. So everybody knows, and that's all on the table. And I think that was a good sequence. There's another section where, again, they kind of go back and forth through this doorway. They learn over the course of time, basically, that the rose that Jake found in the wastelands, basically they think is like a portal that connects directly to the Dark Tower that has to be preserved. And so they go back a lot and discuss, there's this whole plot thread with Calvin Tower and how he's been holding on to this lot. And so basically they need to go back into that time and acquire this from him. So there's a lot of back and forth there. They're trying to protect him from Balazar and some of the other guys that are trying to basically buy this land. And so they have to go back and forth a couple of times in order to do so, to like save him. Eddie saves him, which I think is a cool sequence when he goes into the bookstore and saves him from some of Balazar's guys, and then basically gives him instructions of like, if you want to stay alive, you need to go away for whatever time. And so, but we don't get a kind of a resolution to that whole arc. We know that there's going to be more that comes to that in the following books. Again, like I said, Jake learns about Andy. He learns about Slightman, the elder, who is betraying the town. And then basically they come together as a town and they basically vote that and say like, yes, we're going to have the gunslingers try to protect us come hell or high water. Roland kind of lays out the plan. And then you finally get to the confrontation with the wolves. So the big reveal is that wolves they're actually robots and that they've been programmed. Again, I think that we could have seen this coming by how King kind of telegraphs a few things here and there, but it's still kind of a cool reveal. And then there's basically this big setup of how they're going to, they confront Andy. They kill Andy in a sequence that I thought was really good. Roland confronts Slightman, and again, an amazing scene. I think King writes Roland just so well, where he basically just like is trashing his honor, making him feel shamed for what he's done, and basically just telling him like, there's no path for you in this community anymore after the choices that you've made. It's so good. And then the confrontation with the wolves comes and goes in like 10 pages, which is kind of crazy. There's so much build up to it, and then it's very quick. So, I think it was good, but it did feel very like there was a lot of build up to something that was very short. There are a couple of casualties, the main one being the friend that Jake makes. And then this becomes a big like theme, obviously, of like the loss of childhood, boyhood innocence that Jake has. And now he has to, he's already had to grow up too fast, but now it's like any last semblance of boyhood he had is totally stripped away. And then again, Roland has to confront Slightman because of, now Slightman is pissed that his son died and is obviously grieving, but Roland still, it's, everything he told against him and how he betrayed the town still holds up. So that ends. It's a good sequence, but then right as the book ends, and it basically ends on a cliffhanger, Susanna's alter personality, Mia, overtakes herself, and she basically goes and she's able to flee. She goes through a doorway and then closes it from the other side in the doorway cave. She takes the Black 13, and that's how she's able to do this. So it ends on this triumphant note of like, we did this, we saved this town, we proved who we are as gunslingers yet again, but now we've lost a core member of our quartet. And basically they end kind of in this split path where Roland wants to keep following the tower, and he knows they need to go back to New York into the timeline with Calvin Tower to protect this rose, because they think that leads directly to the tower. And Eddie wants to go after Susanna because he loves her. And there's kind of like this, again, there's no resolution to it, but it feels like in book 6, there's going to be a parting of the ways between the two of how they can do both these things at the same time. So I think that overall, again, I think this was a great book. I think there's a couple of sections that hold it back. I think the Tadash sequences are a little bit too long. You can feel like the gears turning with him trying to make some of the plotting work. I don't love the Mia Susanna back and forth, and then I think the Father Callahan stuff, while interesting and I love him as a character, is just a little bit too long for the scope of this book. And again, I've seen this. I've seen it said and mentioned in reviews of this book before, but this book really does feel like one long side quest. And I was shocked about that again, just given how Wizard and Glass went. So untraditional, but I still think it's a very good book. It's just that I did expect them to get a little farther along the path of the beam to get to the Dark Tower, and that just doesn't really happen. But I do think that it introduces some interesting plot threads of it feels like they now know and can use this power that they figured out with the help of Father Callahan, that is basically how they're going to directly connect themselves to the tower by getting back to this timeline in New York. And I guess I should mention the big reveal at the end is that Roland discovers a copy of Salem's Lot, the novel by Stephen King in this book. So the point of all of Dark Tower, it's all a connecting thread of basically everything from Stephen King's perspective, and it's like a crossing of all these worlds. So I'm guessing that's going to become a thing in the next couple books as well, now that he physically is introduced as a character in this. So there's a lot happening with a ton of that back and forth. But again, it's like it feels pretty clear now of where they have to go to kind of actually get to and approach the Dark Tower. So yeah, I think this was a great book. I'm going to give this 4 stars. I wish it kind of could have pushed forward a little bit more, but I still think it's really good character interactions. I like how King builds tension and kind of ratchets to this final confrontation at the very end of the book. And again, it does leave on a cliffhanger that definitely makes you want to go to the next book very quickly. So I'm going to give it 4 stars. I think out of the 5 books so far that I've read, it's going to be number 4, though. I think it's going to be I'm still struggling with Wizard and Glass, but I think it would still be number 1 is The Drawing of the Three. Number 2 is Wizard and Glass. Number 3 is The Wastelands. 4 is Wolves of the Calla. 5 is The Gunslinger. So I think that's where I'm at right now. Very much enjoyed reading this book. And I'm just excited to see what happens next. So I'll be reading Song of Susanna probably within the next few weeks or so. And excited to see what happens. So thanks for listening.